Hi everyone, welcome back. So I have invited my friend and fellow podcast host Hannah to talk to you today. And I just wanted to really question Hannah a little bit about her process of running a successful podcast, managing guests, using a studio, coming up with ideas to podcast weekly in some of the seasons. I've been on the outside looking in and it's been fascinating. I just thought you guys might find it really interesting. So welcome, Hannah.
Hello, Claire. Thank you for having me.
Well, you're so welcome. It looks very cozy where you are today. Lovely bookshelves.
Thank you. Absolutely.
So you have a wonderful podcast called Happily Ever After, and I've been listening for just over a year, I think now, but you've been running the podcast for a couple of years, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I started in kind of July 2022.
And it's always quite a big question to ask somebody, what's your background? What brought you to podcasting? But do you have a succinct answer for that? Like, why did you decide to start a podcast?
But I always just really wanted one. I used to listen to people like Tim Ferriss, and I was like, oh, I love this so much. I just love conversation and just how you can never plan where it's going to end up, and you're always surprised. So
Mm.
it started off with my blog, and I was like, but I would love to have a podcast, and I didn't have the guts.
And so around public speaking or, putting yourself out there, because if you've got a blog, that's kind of written style, putting yourself out there, allowing people to read it, allowing people to comment, but a podcast felt like an up level from that.
Yeah, I think it was something around just feeling like I didn't have enough to say.
Mm.
Like I don't have enough to talk about, so I don't even know where I would begin.
Mhm.
Very weird.
Mhm. Strange. And where did you begin? So take us back 2 years ago. You were like, okay, this is me. Like, was that in your living room by yourself in a podcast studio? What happened?
I was basically, this is a story of failure. I was trying to promote something. I just got through the hardest part of a divorce. And I was like, I know I need to do something with this. And I'm not quite sure what it is. But I basically had it in my head. I was going to do a divorce retreat. And so I went, right, I'm going to do a podcast because this is how I'm going to promote this retreat. Um, so I literally sat down, I wrote 8 podcasts, and I went, this is neuro spicy stuff here. I just literally went all in, zoomed in on, I'm going to write this thing. I need to promote my retreat. And so, in order to do this, I'm going to make sure I hold myself accountable. And I hired a studio and said it's going to be next week. It was crazy behavior, if I'm honest, but it was the way that it helped me get started because I went, I've paid money and now I'm going to make sure that I actually launch this thing, which I think you and I would both agree now that we've learned how much we have over the last few years, that going at things a bit slower is potentially a nicer way of doing things. But sometimes you just have to work with what you've got. And at the time, I needed that accountability and that push to go, I'm going to get started.
And I suppose then going into a podcast studio, like I've not been in one, but I've been on the radio, so I feel like it's sort of similar. But I feel like in that environment, you are already a podcast host before you've even hosted your first podcast. It's like, well, I'm here. I've booked it. I'm here. There's the mic. I'm imagining now like the police two-way windows or whatever. I don't know. Never been in one.
That's
But I
totally
just
what.
feel I just feel like it's serious, right? It feels serious. Whereas I'm at home, like in my studio office, I've got these nice IKEA soundproof boards. It's very chill. Like I felt very chill coming to a podcast. And I think I had to because I think if I'd have done what you did, I would have frozen. I'd probably be okay now, but I think when I first started, I would have just like frozen and not known what to say.
I think that's the difference between us. I'm all or nothing, right?
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
I'm in my 7th year of quitting alcohol because I just couldn't handle this moderation thing. And I think it was the same with the podcast. So if I had done one at a time, it just would have fizzled out.
Yeah, you needed that. Like, I'm gonna just batch create. I'm going in. I'm gonna record them. And also, you've sat and wrote 8 episodes. Like that's magic. Just 8 fully formed episodes flew out of you, and you wanted to record those.
So, yeah, and that actually ended up becoming the basis of my book later on. I went back to those episodes. I'm like, holy cow, I wrote it 2 years ago, not even realizing what I was doing. So it was like this magical moment of just being like, I know I have to do this. I'm just going to push myself, get through it. But in all honesty, it was very hard. And like the end of, because I recorded 8 podcasts in one day.
Wow. Like, and so they're like somewhere between 30 minutes and an hour each. So like
They were
essentially eight to
probably,
8 hours of recording.
yeah, what they weren't long. They were probably,
Mhm.
the longest was half an hour.
Okay, but still. Mhm.
Yeah. And I was terrified.
Mm.
I was so scared. And by the end of it, it was like the end of the marathon when you just step over the line and then you're like, that was my last step.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
fell over and had a massive oversharing. What's it called when you have,
A revelation. No.
it was like that moment
Oh,
afterwards.
vulnerability hangover.
Yes, the vulnerability hangover.
One of them.
And it took
Yeah.
me like 3 days to get over it. So I
Mm.
wouldn't recommend doing it that way, but equally it got me started.
And I love it. Like, I love that investment in yourself as well, because you know your creative process. And even though you say that's a big thing to do, you've circled back 2 years later, well, less than 2 years later, but then at the point of kind of me coming to your book launch and now understanding that those early podcast episodes helped you to formulate what was in the book. Like, that's magic. That's 2 years of a creative process, 2 years of like material to kind of set you on your way. It's
Mhm.
really interesting. One of the themes in the course is around hearing our voice, writing to hear our voice. So this is something that I've noticed in myself, but I also noticed in my clients as well, where there's this really beautiful sweet spot where we're writing, and that might be on a Word document, might be in our notebook, it might be on Substack. And somewhere within that writing, we kind of witness ourselves and go, oh, I didn't know that I felt that, but that is what I feel. And I feel like there's something in podcasting, especially with the energetics of it and the kind of the whole throat chakra thing and being really open to share, that fast forwards that for me. So sometimes when I'm being interviewed or sometimes when I come to the microphone and I've got my topics, it then goes in this other big direction. And I'm like, wow, like this is much bigger than I thought when I first was sketching out the outline of this. I don't know whether you could speak to any of that.
Oh my goodness, everything.
Mm.
And sometimes I would go into such a flow when I'm in conversation that when I listen back, I'm like, wow, I can't believe that I'm that smart. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
You're
yeah.
like, I can't believe that came out of my mouth. So it's like this beautiful ability to witness what some of the magic that is within you that you just can't always see yourself. I don't know if
Mm.
that, I don't mean to sound big-headed with that. I just mean that
No,
everyone
I mean,
has
yeah, I
this
love it.
within us.
Hmm.
And it's sometimes you need to step out of yourself to witness what is actually, yeah, within you and what people are able to see that you don't always notice.
It's really beautiful, really, really beautiful to hear you talk about that and to get more into understanding what podcasting can unlock and using our voice in that way can unlock. I really wanted to circle into how you have supported yourself with the podcast. So I've met your podcast chum chum Katie. She's awesome. So when I first met Katie, like I'd heard Katie's voice on the podcast and I knew that Katie supported Hannah with the podcast, but I didn't actually really know what she did, like what her job was and like how that all worked. So I'm imagining obviously you've recorded these 8 episodes. Does someone just like send you those? You know, do you go off with a memory stick and then you've like got them, like don't drop them down the drain? Like what happens, you know, like how does it then become a podcast in the world that people can listen to? And how did it then kind of turn into something that you were able to share the load of, I guess, with the technical side?
Yeah, I think the other thing is at the time my self-esteem was like pretty zero. I really desperately wanted to prove myself, but there were these resistances I had to actually getting the work done once it was there. So I brought in Katie and I was like, oh, because she used to work with me years ago. And then we happened to bump into each other just as I recorded the podcast. I'm like, this is for a reason. And I was like, can you help me physically get them out? Like, upload them. I was getting her to transcribe them all at the time, not realizing there was AI software.
Wow.
She cottoned on quite quickly to the fact that you could do all that. Yeah, getting it up on the site and then creating social media so that we could share it. And really, I needed that, like, just that holding space and keeping me feeling safe when I was feeling so vulnerable was really important. And then she ended up coming on the podcast absolutely loads of times, and just it ended up being this crazy journey over 2 years of like, what am I even here for? Why are we doing this? And then it all came to fruition in this book. Yeah, it was just magic, really was.
And so at the book launch, Hannah's book launch, Katie interviewed Hannah, and then this is very meta. That was a live podcast episode, right? So I was witnessing a book launch and a live podcast episode that I could now circle back and listen to, right?
And you're even on it.
I'm on it.
You're on it, babe.
How cool is that? So I guess one of the things that has really struck me as I've been listening to you and knowing you the way that I do, and probably why I've been very inspired to write this course, is we can show up and see where the creative journey takes us with podcasting. And by podcasting, we don't have to be Tim Ferriss, we don't have to be #1 top spot in whatever on Apple podcasts. We can just show up and listen and tune into our creative voice, work out what it is that we need support of. Like, for some people, getting everything branded up will help them feel really safe in the world to launch, and that's cool and that's great. For other people, like, I've only just uploaded my artwork to Apple because I hadn't realized it hadn't pulled through properly from Substack, so it hasn't mattered this far, and I've just hit 30,000 downloads, so it's fine. We can be a bit scrappy as well. It's like, whichever way it goes, whatever is calling to you in terms of how you want to structure things. And I'm always really fascinated around the length of podcasts, whether it's with a guest or a solo episode. And I know one of my biggest fears was, well, how long should I talk for? Because I feel like I'm going to be struggling after 10 minutes. So there's a real art, isn't there, of kind of maybe having some things in your back pocket ahead of time, but also just letting things go where the flow takes you if it's a solo episode and if it's a guest episode as well. I suppose the other side is like keeping people kind of on topic and making sure it's still interesting to the listeners.
So to begin with, whenever I was doing interviews with people, they would go on for like an hour. Sometimes would just flow all the way through. And I used to love that. But I have been trying to shorten that down a little bit to make the process of, I guess as well, just to be a bit more efficient. Like, it means we can get 2 episodes out of a 1-hour slot. So I do try and keep it to 20 to 30 minutes now. And it might be like, right, so Amber was on that last week. I'm like, right, Amber, we're going to talk about this for 20 minutes. I'm going to cut it off, and then we're going to talk about this for 20 minutes. That's a really nice way of, you're still creating content for a weekly show, but it's not taking you as long.
Yeah. It's sort of TED Talk length, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, distill the nuggets. And then so you've said it's weekly. So are you like committed to mostly every week and then you'll have a little period off? Like, is it like a certain number of episodes a season? How do you work all that stuff out?
Oh, darling, I've got no plan.
No plan.
So basically the first 18 months, me and Katie produced something like 78 episodes. And then I basically burnt out. It was just before Christmas. And I was like, if I don't take a break, something bad's going to happen.
Yeah.
So this is, I guess, where you need to combine like what's your self-worth saying to you and what is actually necessary. So things like paying for a studio is not necessary. There were plenty of times when Katie and I were literally sat in my wardrobe just for sound dampening and producing it ourselves. Yeah, so don't let the money put you off. It's just what's going to motivate you. And if the first view in a studio gets you going, okay, I'm on a podcast, and gets you started, invest, go for it, but you don't need it.
Yeah, and you've had guests, like we've podcasted on Zoom, so I've zoomed in and we've recorded it that way. I can't remember whether you were in a studio or not that time. I don't think you were the first time, but then you've also invited guests to come into the studio and then you've kind of batched them up that way as well. So rather than just weaving it into your weekly life, you've gone, okay, I'm going to book a studio for half a day and this is how it's going to be, because there's some there's some support with that, isn't there? There's something where you can feel quite held in that.
Yeah, and you're just having to show up once. You're having to prepare yourself once, and then you're there, and it's
Ah,
like,
yeah.
right, I'm recording
Hmm.
5, and I'm in that space of
Hmm.
just going through it. I've prepared. I don't like write word for word what I'm going to say, but I've prepared the questions.
Hmm.
Like I've got a vibe of what I'm going to say, and I've done it for 5 people, and then by lunchtime, that's done.
That's it done, yeah. And so then my last question is just about the intro and the outro, the music, and then the introduction to the guest. So this was one of the things that I found the hardest to feel like I'd got right. I still can't really listen to it because I just find it super cringe, but I did it. It's gone out with all the episodes that it's gone out, it's fine. Did you have like a professional scripting team? Like how did you script that really important information at the top of the show and then the close of the show? Do you do the bit where you reintroduce the guest? So after you've recorded, would you then go back and say, okay, like this is such and such, they are this person in the world, and we talked about X, Y, and Z, or do you leave that bit out? Do you know which bit I mean? This is in the pro podcast world. Yeah.
So I have an intro with music that goes at the beginning of every podcast. The music, I was literally sat in Morrison's Cafe after the first day of podcasting going, wow, I can't believe I've just recorded 8. Sat in Morrison's Cafe eating some food because I hadn't eaten all day. And then I was just going through music on a thing, and I went, okay, that one's quite nice and that one's quite nice. Like I just didn't overthink it.
Mm-hmm.
I just went, I'll buy those 2, and I sent that over to the guy who was producing it to pull it all
Mm-hmm.
together. I wrote the first introduction myself. The second time we redid it, I was working with a kind of branding friend of mine, and she helped me write that one. And then the most recent iteration was done by the people who helped me produce the podcast now, but they also helped me write my, like, produce my book. So it's
Mm-hmm.
like an amalgamation of the 2 things. But really, I don't think we spent that long on it.
Yeah, yeah. And I feel like if anyone listens to Hannah's intro, like what I really like about it is she plants us directly into her story, but also gives us that permission to take up space in our own. So it's that like this is me, but then also this is all of us. Like it's the thing. I think one of them, and it might not be in this new one, but it's the stuff that makes us human. It's like, oh, shoulder drop. Yes, it's the stuff that makes us human. I'm safe here. I can listen. I can lean in. Like it just felt very, very cool. And I feel like that bit of play on the fairy story that we all thought that we wanted when we were younger, perhaps, I did write my dissertation about the ideological values in Disney movies. So I'm very connected to fairy stories in lots of different ways, but that happily ever after concept and that deconstructing it and kind of going, this is actually a much more complicated topic than we ever gave it credit for. I feel like you get that across in the intro, and you might think that didn't take you long, but I think it's very sophisticated and it's very it's very congruently you. So there's something that can feel, okay, like this is just something I need to script, but actually I think it's almost like space holding and then condensing that down into like a magic potion to kind of introduce and just shake that magic potion so people understand. So you did that very well, I wanted to say.
Oh, thanks.
You're
Lovely.
welcome. You're welcome.
And
And
I
so,
suppose, sorry, I was going to say on that, it's like maybe the first, like, don't overthink it. And probably, well, what I would say is get into your body and breathe, and then try and channel what it is that you're trying to do, and maybe write it from that space so that you're not in your head and you're more in your body. Does that make sense?
massively. And actually, some of the early questions I've had from people who have bought into the course are around the freeze response. So that nervous
That's just
system
fear, right?
response, yeah, that
Yeah.
they come to the laptop, and whether it's on Zoom or whether there's a microphone there, their entire body is in freeze. So
Yeah.
there's something really interesting about you with your background as a yoga practitioner being able to say, we've got to drop in first, like we're not just delivering from here,
Oh,
we're
right.
dropping in, we're embodying, we're speaking out. And we're also, I think for me, sometimes it helps me to connect to who's listening. So rather than us having the conversation here, which obviously I deeply appreciate, it's like it's less about me and more about them. So that sometimes helps me get out of my head a bit.
Ooh. Yeah, that's really good. And I think, like, I don't know how much your listeners know about human design, but understanding what is open for you is very crucial. So I'm starting
Mm,
to learn more and more that if I want to record anything with my voice, where I've got a very exact message, I need to almost be on my own. I can't even be able to see people outside of the space of me, because I'll start bringing in different people's energy and I won't be saying what I truly want to channel.
It's true. I feel like there's something as well in the neurospicy hyper focus where that when I get in this little corner and I know, my husband, my kids aren't here at the moment, the puppy's obviously sleeping, everything's quite calm, versus when I try and record downstairs, which I have had to do a few times just with sharing the space, that brings in strands of distraction and then I've lost it. I've got to try and drop in and get it back again and like refocus. So there is something in gifting ourselves the space and time properly, isn't there, to kind of lean in and give it a go.
Yeah.
I'll let you go, but I just wanted to ask for the last question around podcasting. Do you feel like it's something that you will always do as part of your creative practice? Like, did you ever feel that it was going to be a long-term thing, or was it just the thing? And, how does it sit with you now? Can you see yourself still podcasting in 5 years' time? How do you feel about it?
Oh, I really hope so, because I just love it so much. I just love the freedom of being able to sit down and just see what comes up. And almost certainly it's going to be magic. There'll be bits of it where you're like, that was a bit long, but there'll be a moment when you're like, oh, that was gold. So I really hope
Mm.
I am. But it is a constant question of but weighing up like time versus what am I getting out of it? And I think even if it's just that I'm enjoying it, that's enough.
Oh, beautiful. I love that. And that's a lovely note to finish. I should ask Hannah to share her links of where you can find her online, because she is writing on Substack. She's over on Instagram and she's got a brilliant website portal where you can find all of our links and buy a book, How to Divorce Sober. So could you just give us your links, Hannah, before you go?
Absolutely. So I am hannahharvey.uk. That's my website. Hannah Harvey UK is on Instagram. And then I am Hannah Harvey on Substack.
I
Hannah
think
Harvey's Love
so.
Notes. Hannah Harvey Love Notes.
And I'll link everything below. So if you want to just hop straight over and find in the post all of the different links to find Hannah and connect to our work further, then you can find those there. Thanks again, Hannah.
My pleasure.